So I'm Yank Lambert, I'm a philosophy grad student, and I'm representing the Graduate Student Steering Committee who's tasked with putting on events like this. And we were prompted by Professor Pinker's article in the New Republic last year, which he tries to persuade his colleagues in the humanities that the sciences are not their enemy, and that prompted a lot of discussion. And so we hope to just continue that discussion here today, and we actually hope for some spirited debates. So we encourage you to ask a lot of tough questions once that time comes. But I'll turn it back over to Professor Harrington for some proper introductions.
My name is Ann Harrington. I'm a professor in the history of science here at Harvard, but I'm maybe here because for 6 years I was co-directed the Mind-Brain Behavior Initiative and was deeply engaged with the intellectual challenge of how to create dialogue that brings disciplines that may work in rather different ways or may not always completely understand or even completely respect each other, how you bring them together in fruitful conversation and move knowledge forward. And one of the real insights that came out of that period was how hard this is. That interdisciplinarity is really hard. And even though Enoch has encouraged everyone to ask hard questions and he wants lively debate, and that's absolutely right, I think we also perhaps want to see if we can move the conversation beyond parody and polarization, that we know how to fight. And we all know the terms of opprobrium, that the one side is scientific and reductionistic and arrogant, and the other side is waffly and postmodern and relativistic. And we know those moves, but is there some way that we can actually begin to unpack how disciplines in the humanities function, the kinds of knowledge that they seek and when they're lucky they actually achieve, how it works in the sciences, where there's genuine fruitful opportunities for mutual enrichment, and where perhaps the disciplines best function autonomously. And I think it's in that spirit that the speakers here are embarking on this conversation. This is obviously something in the air because there's another event going on at MIT tonight that has Steve Pinker's wife actually on the panel. And I don't know, I think that's somehow wonderful. But ours comes first, so we can kind of set the agenda. I think this idea is that there will be two short-ish presentations. I'm going to then invite my two speakers up here to have a little conversation between each other, to kind of set a framework, a more synthetic framework that will then in turn open up to all of you and invite you to come in. And really the idea is for this to be catalytic, not definitive. The event will be as good as your questions in the end and as the conversations that we can generate together. So without further ado, let me just slightly more formally introduce the speakers. In some ways they are the kinds of speakers that need no introduction, but just in case, Steven Pinker, Harvard College professor, Johnstone Family Professor. He's in the Department of Psychology here. His research area in psychology is language and cognition. He's authored many books that many of you have probably read, including The Language Instinct, How the Mind Works, The Blank Slate. He also frequently writes, as we heard already from Enoch, for publications like New Republic, New York Times, and of course the New Republic article is the one that kind of is the reason we're all here, I think. Susanna Siegel is the Edgar Pierce Professor of Philosophy here at Harvard. She works primarily in the area of philosophy of mind, philosophy of perception, epistemology. In addition to publishing many chapters in journal articles, she's the author of a monograph entitled The Contents of Visual Experience, which one of her esteemed colleagues has described as one of the most significant books on the philosophy of mind for many years. So it's a high-powered set of interlocutors that we have here. So I'm going to invite Professor Pinker to take the podium first and tell us his views on the relationship between science and the humanities as it concerns the human mind. Then Professor Siegel will do her take on this. They will then have a conversation with one another, and then we'll open it up. We look forward to a lively evening.
Thank you, Anne. My thoughts on science, humanities, and the human mind are no secret. I believe that there is a pressing imperative in modern intellectual life to integrate them more than they have been historically. Can you hear me? Yes. I think, following suggestions from our colleague E.O. Wilson and arguments also put forward by John Tooby, Lita Cosmides, and others, that integrating the sciences with the humanities is a culmination of a process that has long been unifying supposedly incommensurable metaphysical realms. Before Isaac Newton, it was commonly believed that the universe was cleaved in two by the orbit of the moon, that above the moon there were eternal, pristine mathematical laws. Beneath the moon there was decay, change, corruption, all kinds of uncontrollable grubbiness. Newton, by imagining that the same force that pulled an apple down from a tree kept the moon in its orbit, first unified these realms by saying a single set of laws governs the entire cosmos. It used to be thought that the past and present were qualitatively different, that until recently there were events that shaped the Earth as we know it, that built the mountains and the rivers and the oceans, and that now we have things like weather and erosion and earthquakes. Lyell first, the great geologist, first unified the past and the present, the formative past and the changing present, by saying that the same forces that we see around us now, like erosion and earthquakes, are responsible for the mountain ranges and plains and other geographical features that we see. It used to be thought that living and non-living matter were different kinds of stuff, that living things were made out of some kind of quivering, pulsating gel called protoplasm, until Friedrich Wöhler synthesized urea out of everyday chemicals and showed that living things are made out of the same kind of matter as everything else. And then it was also thought that the world of designed entities, the teleological world of complex systems that seem to be organized by bringing about a goal, obeyed completely different laws than ordinary matter, which just obeyed feed-forward causation, until first Darwin, then Mendel and Watson and Crick fleshed out a theory according to which purely forward-acting causal forces could give rise to organisms that appeared as if they had been designed with a goal in mind, but were subject to the same laws of physics as everything else. We face one more chasm today, and that is the biological versus the cultural, the idea that these somehow sit in separate metaphysical realms. Also known as nature versus society, and reinforced in bricks and mortar in many universities in the division between the sciences on the one hand and the social sciences and humanities on the other. But I think that wall is being torn down. That when you think about it, what is art, what is culture, what are societies? They are ultimately products of human minds, which are products of the activity of the brain, which are products of the organizing forces of evolution. What artists do is they use faculties of perception and imagination and social cognition and emotion. That's what gets engaged when we appreciate works of art. And cultures emerge from the spread of ideas and norms and inventions by which humans share the fruits of their process of discovery and negotiate ways of resolving their inherent conflicts in social contracts. Now, the advantage of knitting the sciences and humanities more closely together is that I think that it can address some of the malaise of the humanities. It's no secret, and it is not an accusation that I'm making, that you can see it in any report on the state of the humanities, that not all is going well. Enrollments are declining, prestige is plummeting, the funding has suffered. Some of these are due to exogenous forces like the commercialization of the university, but I think some of it is that there's a perception among many students that they're just not as excited by what's going on in the humanities. And I think that if the humanities were to be more tightly integrated with the science, that would change, that there are vast opportunities for exciting discoveries that would attract the kind of people of brilliant students that today might be sucked into the sciences. Also, it would define a progressive agenda for the humanities, a way in which to say that there's new ways of doing things of the kind that can generate intellectual ferment and, not incidentally, donations from people who aren't excited by doing the same old, but are hopeful that there are new frontiers of the expansion of knowledge. But the benefits would certainly not be one way. I think that the sciences have enormous amounts to gain from the greater attention to the subject matter of the humanities. It would provide the sciences with rich and ecologically valid phenomena that would go well beyond laboratory studies that could often be sterile and misleading. Let me just give you some examples. It's a little misleading that my opposite number from the humanities this evening is a philosopher, because I think philosophy is an example of a discipline in the humanities where this kind of consilience is a fait accompli. And for many decades, maybe more than decades, it's often hard to see where the discipline of philosophy leaves off and the relevant sciences begin. This is particularly true in philosophy of mind, which is now very tightly connected with cognitive science and neuroscience. It would be in the technical literature in philosophy, many topics such as consciousness, innate ideas, the mind-body problem, imagery, private language, epistemology, morality, and metaethics make full use of discoveries from the sciences. Now, this doesn't mean that philosophy has been subsumed as a branch of the sciences, and I will get to that later, just that the professional debates make full use of what we've discovered, often last year's discovery in the relevant sciences. Another branch of the humanities where this is a fait accompli is in the humanistic study of language. In linguistics, philology, and history of English are beneficially tightly integrated with psycholinguistics and neurolinguistics. I'll give you an example from my own research, and that is the way that languages change over time. So here's a fact about the history of the English language, a quintessential topic in the humanities. English in the Old English and Middle English periods had more than twice as many irregular verbs as we see today. The past tense of chide used to be chid, not chided. The past tense of help used to be holp. And so irregular verbs have been dying off like endangered species. Why has this happened? Well, this is something that I looked at by integrating historical linguistics with modern psycholinguistics and neurolinguistics. If you look at the fate of the verbs that have defected from the irregular to the regular side, like chided, they tend to be the less frequent verbs in the language, the ones that people don't use every day. Well, there is a well-documented property of human memory, namely less frequently encountered things are harder to remember. The irregular forms, by definition, flout the regular rules, whereas chide today has a predictable past tense by applying the rule add ed. Hide hid or ride rode is idiosyncratic. There's no way to learn it except by brute force memory. Now, if you imagine that the way languages are passed down over time is that there's a new cycle of memorization with each generation of children that's exposed to the language, then if a verb drops in frequency, it may not be encountered often enough for children to memorize an idiosyncratic form, in which case children will default to the regular add ed rule, which applies under any circumstances, memorized or not. The word will fall from irregular to regular for that generation and all subsequent generations. And that's why there's been a constant nibbling away at the irregulars. It can also explain the occasional counterexample. Every once in a while, a new irregular will enter the language. The most recent example is the verb sneak, snuck. Those of you in the room who are under the age of 60 will have no problem with snuck. Those of you who are probably 70 or older will perceive it as kind of slang or cutesy or jocular. So we are seeing historical change in action. Why should sneak buck the tide in which irregulars become regular? Well, another principle of human memory is that we tend to superimpose similar items, similar often in articulatory commands by which we pronounce them. Now, we have a lot of irregular verbs in English like stick, stuck, dig, dug. If you look at the commands by which you control your tongue and lips to produce sneak, they overlap a lot with stick. That isn't reflected in the spelling, but it is reflected in the articulation. Since stick, stuck is a very common irregular form, it tends to attract sneak to it, and people analogize it to snuck. That force could push in the other direction and result in the creation of new irregular forms. So a topic in the humanities, namely the history of language, can in part be explained by facts in psychology having to do with memory and analogy, and ultimately in neurobiology. Let me give you another example. This one is just quite salient in my mind because my most recent book is a style manual in which I take on another quintessential topic in the humanities, how to write more clearly. And I believe that, and I've argued that a number of the traditional style guides, such as the iconic Elements of Style by William Strunk and E.B. White, have a number of flaws, a number of instances of bad advice, a number of instances of ludicrous advice, because it was written in innocent of modern discoveries about how language works. Modern grammatical theory, evidence-based dictionaries, which often use large online corpora of English text, and findings from cognitive science on what makes a sentence easier or hard to understand. Just to give you one more example that, again, is close to home. A few years ago, wrote a book called The Better Angels of Our Nature on the history and psychology of violence, where the lines between history, government, and philosophy on the one hand, and psychology, neurobiology, quantitative social science, and complexity on the other hand, were quite porous. I couldn't do without either. Just to give you an example, if you plot rates of homicide over the centuries, you get a massive decline. And historical criminologists have done that. It's a completely boring question whether they are scientists or humanists. They go back to archives, they brush off the mouse turds, they calculate the number of court cases that on homicide over time, they plot the curves. One can then ask the question, why did this happen? Well, that's a question of cause and effect of the kind that social scientists deal with every day. On the other hand, in addressing this puzzling phenomenon, why did the medievals kill each other at 50 times the rate that modern Europeans do? One has to look at the narratives of life as it was lived at the time in order to provide hypotheses, such as etiquette books that called out the impulsive responses to insults that often would result in knife fights in pubs and over the dinner table. The fact that at the time that the curve plummets, you have all this hortatory advice to be more civilized, curb your emotions, provides us a hypothesis as the kind of change that propelled this decline in the statistics. Now, I think these are, I'm not holding these out as how one ought to do research. These are just examples that are familiar to me that would not have been possible if I thought that the humanities and sciences were different realms. And I think there are tremendous new opportunities for discoveries in other aspects of the humanities. The visual arts, I think, have a lot to contribute to and learn from the study of visual perception and the study of evolutionary aesthetics. Why do we get pleasure out of certain faces and bodies and landscapes and colors and forms? Some of you may have heard Marge Livingstone from Harvard Medical School, who's done some fascinating work along these lines. And there's actually an interesting Harvard historical connection, because this kind of consilience may have been more common a century ago than it is today. It may be something that we've lost. And the art historian Marianne Teuber at MIT has made a strong circumstantial case that many of the modernist painters, the Cubists, the abstract expressionists, were avid consumers of the perceptual psychology of the day, particularly the Gestalt psychology, but also some of the earlier psychophysics, which was brought to them by Gertrude Stein, who was an undergraduate student of William James here in, I guess at the time it was the philosophy department, but philosophy and psychology tellingly were not separate fields in those days. She did an undergraduate thesis with William James. She went over to Europe, had her salon, and quite plausibly brought a lot of exciting ideas about visual perception to the attention of the pioneers of modern art. I find it amazing that there aren't more connections between the study of music and the study of auditory perception, and for that matter, the study of language. The analysis of fiction, I think, could benefit from applications of cognitive and evolutionary psychology. And again, we're seeing some of that. Here at Harvard, there's the Cognition, Brain Theory, and the Arts seminar that has been run by Elaine Scarry and others, which I think has explored some very interesting connections in that regard. Before I conclude, let me outline some things that consilience is not, to allay some of the fears that are evoked when this kind of program is discussed. Consilience is not, consilience, I'm sorry I didn't introduce that term, is an old term revived by Ed Wilson to refer to the unity of knowledge. It literally means jumping together. It is not the same as reductionism, at least it's not the same as bad reductionism. And I think it's good to distinguish a defensible kind of reductionism from a destructive kind of reductionism. Destructive reductionism would say that you obliterate any description at a higher abstract level of analysis and reduce everything to itty-bitty little components. Say you have to explain World War I in terms of the physics, the movement of particles. Because after all, World War I is nothing but a bunch of particles moving in very, very complicated ways. Well, I don't think anyone would actually advocate that, and if they do, they'd be wrong. But I think there is a good kind of reductionism, if you will. You could call it hierarchical reductionism, in which phenomena are explained at multiple levels of analysis. They are not mutually exclusive. And in particular, the unanalyzed elements at one level, the black boxes, the things that you pull out of the air as just obvious explanans, are themselves unpacked and explained at a lower level of analysis. And so let me be concrete. So yeah, you don't explain World War I in terms of the language of physics. On the other hand, the kind of explanations that historians would adduce, such as a Hobbesian trap of mutual fear of attack, such as the rise of nationalism, which is a kind of tribalism projected to the level of the nation state, such as demonization of the opponent, such as overconfidence, the fact that both sides were confident that the war would be over by Christmas, and they were both tragically wrong. I don't think it's illegitimate to ask why our species is subject to each of those dynamics. Why do we have tribalism? Is it part of our evolutionary nature? And if so, what was the advantage that it conferred on our ancestors? What are the circumstances that ramp it up or push it down? If the world's nations were led by women, would there be less of it? Likewise, overconfidence. How could you have two adversaries both completely certain that they would obliterate the other and both tragically wrong? Again, is there a reason that is baked into our species? Is it affected by testosterone? Is it different between the two sexes? What are the circumstances that can work against it? And so on. This is not reductionism, but this is ordinary intellectual curiosity. If you invoke something like tribalism, I think it is, I would argue that it is perfectly legitimate to say, why does tribalism exist? And the advantage of hierarchical reductionism is explanation. I think that the deep and satisfying sense that we have that something is explained, that we have a new kind of insight about something, depends on some degree of reduction in the sense that things that you take for granted as magic or miracles or just the way things are, or because I said so, themselves can be unpacked and can be explained. My favorite example of the perils of fear of reduction come from the Monty Python sketch, which you can Google. Just Google Monty Python Brontosaurus, and you'll see it. This was the guest on a BBC television program who had not just a theory of the Brontosaurus, but she proudly announced it was her theory of the Brontosaurus and no one else's. And she was crowing during the entire segment about how it was her theory and her theory alone. And finally, when the host wore her down to explain what the theory was, she said, well, my theory of the Brontosaurus is that it's skinny at one end, much, much fatter in the middle, and skinny at the other end. Now, the humor in that is that it's not a theory at all. It's just a description. And theories that are phobic of any possibility of reduction have the danger of becoming like the theory of the Brontosaurus. A second thing that consilience is not is the confusion of logical distinctions. And you'll sometimes see it said that scientists can't discuss the boundaries or domain of science because that's not a scientific question, it's a philosophical question. Or more generally, there is an inherent logical distinction between empirical questions, what I'll loosely call conceptual or logical questions, relationships among ideas, and normative questions. How ought we to act? What licenses us to know things, the moral and the epistemological. Now, I actually agree that these are distinct. I'm not going to argue that they should be collapsed. But what I would argue is that these distinctions are not the same as academic disciplines. It is not the case that science consists of a list of empirical facts. Scientists can't avoid philosophical questions. Are their theories consistent? Is a prediction of a theory really a prediction of the theory? Questions of cosmology, of consciousness, inevitably bump up against questions that are not themselves empirical, but that's okay. And conversely, philosophy does not consist in practice, nor should it in theory, of utterly fact-free conceptual analysis. We don't have philosophy being done in a capsule orbiting Jupiter. Philosophers very much take into account contingent empirical facts in domains like consciousness, language, innate ideas, etc., etc. And morality does not consist of a list of divine commandments that are independent of questions of, say, human suffering and flourishing. The idea that science and morality are non-overlapping magisteria, to use the phrase of our late colleague Stephen Jay Gould, I believe could not be more wrong. Finally, consilience is not the obliteration of the traditional methods of the humanities, particularly as applied to specific works of art. Now, there are various modes of analysis that are conspicuously non-scientific that one sees in the interpretation of particular works, and they've the erudite interpretive stance or interpretation of particular works, deep reading, thick description, hermeneutics. These don't look like science, and they are very much worth nurturing. They are, I think, a precious part of scholarship, and there's no reason that an application of scientific questions and methods to the humanities should replace these more traditional interpretive methods. The idea of consilience is to enrich and diversify the methods of the traditional methods of the humanities, not to obliterate them. There is a but, though. While I think that interpretive methods and erudite commentary have a place, that place is not informing generalizations or causes. And I am willing to take a hard line about the application of erudite authority or overall impressions when it comes to cause and effect and facts in the world. And I'll just be concrete. I was part of a 20 questions event at the Mahindra Center for the Humanities a couple of years ago to discuss the history and psychology of violence. And after presenting many graphs, data sets, statistics on the decline of war, showing that in fact, if you plot deaths in war over the last 2/3 of a century, it has a downward trajectory with a number of levels. And one of the commentators, a esteemed, erudite, well-respected scholar, in his commentary said, well, that's not the impression I get when I read the papers. And I'm a polite colleague, a Canadian. I was brought up not to. And so I didn't say what was on my mind, which is, with all due respect to your erudition and the esteem with which your colleagues hold you, that is a stupid comment. You don't get to, I would fail an undergraduate who would contest a well-validated statistical generalization with a personal impression based on anecdotes. If you do that, you're wrong, and you should know better. So that's a case where there's a systematic reason why I think it was a bad comment. We just know from the history, from the methodology of the social sciences and from cognitive psychology, that arguments from authority are all too often wrong. That being erudite, commanding expertise is a recipe for error, and that the argument from anecdotes, examples, and impressions are also likely to be fallacious. So while I would very much treasure the interpretive methods, there are cases where they will lead to error, and that's a case where the more scientific you are, the better. So to sum up, I think that the history of ideas consists of an increasing consilience, that is, unification of previously disjoint domains of knowledge, that this is increasingly happening to the sciences and the humanities, which is a good thing. It's a fait accompli in philosophy, linguistics, and certain parts of history and political theory, that there are many opportunities for other branches of the humanities to inform and be informed by the relevant sciences, such as music, art, and literature, and that a call for consilience is not the same thing as reductionism, the confusion of the empirical, conceptual, and moral, or the obliteration of the traditional humanities, and that this unification holds tremendous promise for intellectual insight and, I would also argue, improvements in the human condition. Thanks very much.
Okay, so we were invited to discuss science, the humanities, and the human mind, and a natural way to connect these topics is to ask what the humanities can contribute to the study of the mind, where when you study the mind, you aim at knowledge or understanding. So if the aim of the study, if you succeed in studying the mind, then the result is some form of knowledge or understanding. Now, if we were to ask this analogous question for the sciences, the answer would be entirely straightforward. What do the sciences contribute to the study of the mind? The answer is psychology. So that's easy. When you ask what the humanities contribute to the study of the mind, what do they help us understand or know about the mind? The answer is not straightforward. So why not? Well, one reason is that the humanities encompass many different fields of study. Stephen mentioned some. But a much deeper reason is that science sets a standard for knowledge by orienting us away from products of the culture, of the creative imagination, such as superstition and myth, which previously aimed to study the mind. And they shift us away from those products and toward evidence. So before the scientific revolution, if you wanted to know what caused a especially high tide, a myth might tell you that it was giant turtles in the sea. A religious figure might tell you that it was angry gods. But science has better grounds for an answer. It's the sun and the moon. And the marvel of science is that it has a way of eliciting information about the world from the world itself. So the world speaks to us through evidence. Science is based on evidence, and its methods are designed around that basis. But where does that leave the humanities? That's why this question arises. Where does that leave the humanities? So like myth and superstition, which gave us the turtle answer, which is the false answer, about the tides, philosophy and literature rely very heavily on the imagination. So here's what happens to me sometimes when I meet colleagues for the first time in the sciences. So we're at some wonderful MBB event at dinner, and they say, what do you do? And I say, I'm a philosopher of mind. And they say, oh, interesting, are you in a lab? Do you experiment? No, I've never done an experiment in my life. And then they're politely puzzled, and they say, well, geez, so how do you get results? How do you do your research if you don't do any experiments? Or try to be nice about it. So, and you know, because they can't picture how you could come to any understanding or knowledge of the mind if you didn't do experiments, gather evidence in the way that science wonderfully, marvelously does. So And then what would you conclude from that? Of course, they're very polite, so the conversation doesn't go in this exact direction. But what you would conclude, if there wasn't any way to get any knowledge or understanding of the mind except in the way that science does, is you would conclude that either the humanities aren't aiming to study the mind, they're not aiming to understand at all, or else they're just kind of doomed to be some inferior cousin of the sciences. Okay, so I want to answer the question that I get asked all the time by answering a bigger version of it. So they were just asking about philosophy of mind, but I want to answer the question for philosophy in general, and for literature, and for history. How can these fields in the humanities study the mind at all? So my goal is to give you 3 examples of things we understand about the mind thanks to work in the humanities. So that's what I'm going to do. Now, part of what was puzzling my colleagues at dinner when they asked me that, and it does happen a lot, it happens all the time, part of what's puzzling them is that they're fixated on just one among several forms that knowledge can take. So a paradigmatic form of knowledge in the sciences is that what you know when your inquiry goes well is you know a theory or a model or a hypothesis about the mind. And your work with experimentation is designed to have that result. But the world contains problems, and some of those problems are problems about the mind, and so one way you can understand the mind is to understand those problems. So a different form that knowledge can take is understanding of problems. And what do you do when you understand a problem? What do you understand? Well, one thing you understand is you understand exactly what the problem is. You can state it clearly. Another thing you understand is the force of the problem, why it matters, why we care about it, why it really is a problem. And then another thing you understand is what a solution would look like. What would it be like if we solved the problem? What would that look like? And what are some possible solutions? And what are their potential advantages or pitfalls? And you might understand a problem even if you're not sure at the end of the day which solution is the right one. And even if you think that all of the solutions are none of them are completely adequate. Okay, so in other words, when you understand a problem, you analyze a problem. You understand a problem about the mind when you can analyze a problem about the mind. And the analysis of problems is just a very basic form of intellectual inquiry. It's by no means, it's got to span the divide between the humanities and the sciences and the social sciences. Because where would you get your hypotheses, where would you get your motivation for building them if you weren't addressing problems? Okay, so that is a form of knowledge or understanding, is understanding problems. There is another way to study the mind as well, and overlooking this other way I think is also behind the kind of puzzlement of the people I talked to at dinner. So another way you can study the mind is simply to understand certain human experiences. Now, how do you do that? Well, you can understand experiences by having them. You can have them without understanding them. But you can also come to understand them, and sometimes, if you're in that situation, it helps to read about them. You can read textured, detailed descriptions of experiences. So my 3 examples of contributions to the study of the mind from the humanities, things we know or understand about the mind from the humanities, they fall into these categories. So I'll tell you what they are. Okay, so my first example is in the category of understanding a problem. So the problem is, what should I believe? What should I believe? So this is a question. It's a question about not how the mind works, but how the mind should work. Now, why is there a problem about what we should believe? Well, on the face of it, you think, well, I know, I should believe the epistemic authority, like in the case of the times. I should believe what science says about the times. Science is an epistemic authority for reasons that I described and that Stephen described as well. Okay, but what is the epistemic authority? A natural idea is that, more generally than just science, the epistemic authority is evidence. You should believe what fits the evidence. Oftentimes, we know that people don't believe what fits the evidence. So here are some common beliefs that people walk around having that just don't fit the evidence at all. So if you think today in Boston that you're more likely to die from Ebola than you are from crossing the street, that's ignoring what we know about likelihood and contagion. Okay, so we consider these beliefs unreasonable because they don't fit the evidence. So you might think so far when we ask, what should I believe, there really isn't a problem at all. The answer is straightforward. I should believe what fits the evidence. But when we think of other examples, this answer to our question, what should I believe, starts to look a bit more problematic. So there are, I'll give you an example. So suppose that you have somebody, a young student, who's very talented and is very determined initially to do what they want to do. They have high ambitions for themselves, like anyone else. They've got their hopes and fears and ambitions. Now, they have a lot of evidence because they've learned it, that talented and determined people in a social group that they belong to systematically underachieve. So if you take two people, one from this social group X and one from a privileged group, and you hold constant their talent, their gumption, their determination, their hard work, there will be reliably differences in what they can achieve. Okay, now suppose you have two who are in this systematically underachieving social group, and they both initially know this bit of evidence. And this bit of evidence bothers them a lot. They cannot stand it. They have a sense of unfairness and injustice when they imagine what their future would be like if they put all they had into what they want, but yet couldn't get as far as someone else could simply because of the group they belong to. But the two people I'm imagining have different responses to that fact. Okay, one is resigned, and they say, I'm just not going to try for that. I'm going to scale back my ambitions. I'm going to lower my horizons. I'm going to choose what for me is a less appealing life plan. The other person just refuses to believe it. So they heard it, but they think there must just be something wrong with this. Now, we know a lot from psychology, in fact, about the mechanisms by which people respond to evidence that is uncongenial to what they want to believe, that makes them uncomfortable. So let's just suppose that this determined person does that. Okay, what they think is, well, if I try just as hard as an equally talented person from the privileged group, I have an equal chance of success. So they're ignoring the evidence. Now, it's not obvious that that's an unreasonable thing for this person to believe. Either way, you have some psychic disharmony, you have a problem. But this is a case where if you think, what is reasonable for this person to believe, it's not obvious that the reasonable thing to do is to be resigned and to choose a less appealing life plan and to scale back your horizons. Okay, so we have a problem. They have a conflict between, roughly speaking, believing what's useful for you to believe and believing what fits the evidence. And when you have conflicts like that, the question arises of what should you believe? Now, there are many examples like this. Part of what we understand when we understand this problem is the range of examples that arise that have this form. I just gave you one. Okay, now part of understanding a problem is understanding a solution, or what a solution would be like. What a solution would be like here is, it would tell you what to believe and why. It would tell you when, if ever, is it reasonable to believe against the evidence and when isn't. So remember the Ebola person. Think of the person who thinks that climate change is not caused by humans. It might be very comforting for at least the climate change person to believe that climate change is not caused by humans, but we don't think it's okay for them to go ahead and believe it just because it would be congenial to their plans or their goals. For example, say they're the head of a very profitable coal company. There might be very high stakes in their giving up this belief and changing their outlook. Okay, so this is a difficult problem because it's not obvious when it's okay to believe against the evidence and when isn't it. Maybe it's never okay, maybe it's always okay, but the problem is a problem. Okay, now we know a lot about this problem. You would not believe the volume of writing that shows our understanding of this problem. We have ways of feeling the force of the problem. We understand why it's difficult. We understand potential solutions to it. Now, some of that comes from philosophy. That is, there's a lot of discussion in philosophy, in particular in epistemology, about this problem. But that's not the only mode in which you could express an understanding of this problem. You could write a novel. You could write a story that depicts the psychic disharmony that would beset some character, like the ones I described. In fact, you could even write a story that explored the difficulties with each of the potential solutions that the person might try out in trying to figure out what their attitude should be about their future, given the facts. Okay, so that's my first example. And now we could ask, we could ask whether this bit of understanding the mind that comes from the humanities, is it proprietary to the humanities? What's the relationship between the way we have of understanding this problem in philosophy or literature and science? So is this a domain that's ripe for consilience? Is it a domain in which we already find consilience or collaboration? And there I think the answers will no. So science doesn't speak directly to the question of how the mind should work. It speaks directly to very closely related issues about how the mind does work. I mentioned cognitive dissonance theory, an entire theory about what people are prone to do when faced with evidence that makes them uncomfortable. So we know a lot about what would happen if they responded to their situation in one way or another, but none of that even addresses the question of what the response should be to their problem. Okay, my second example of something we understand from the humanities is about a different problem. So this is also in the category of understanding of a problem. So this is a problem about which minds are normal. So when we study the mind, we study sometimes the diseased mind, the pathological mind, and other times the normal mind. And we classify different mental conditions as normal or not normal. And sometimes the classifications are not at all contested. So consider aphasia. So this is a disorder of comprehension and expression of language. Now, so far as I know, this is not highly contested as a pathology. People don't say, no, it's actually not at all a pathological condition to be in, so far as I know. It's very different with homosexuality, which was classified as a psychiatric disorder in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Medical Disorders in the 70s and then later dropped. So there was a shift as to what the status of homosexuality was said by this manual to be. Now, you know that this shift from considering homosexuality a disorder of the mind to considering it not a disorder of the mind, unclassifying it, went along with enormous cultural changes. Now, we know from work in the humanities, from work in history and ethnography, we understand a lot about some of the many factors that that particular classification of normality was sensitive to. So, you know, in a cultural context where homosexuality ceases to be as deeply suppressed in the ways that it was in the years, the first 2 decades of the DSM, which started in 1952, in a cultural context where it ceases to be so suppressed, it's just incredibly implausible to classify it as a disease of the mind. Okay, so we have some inquiry into what counts as a normal mind in this particular case. And now, is that inquiry proprietary to the humanities? It's an inquiry that's done by history, by ethnography, and you don't find courses in the history of psychology in the psychology department. As far as I know, if there were, I would take it. I would love to take that course. But it's not considered part of psychology to study the history of psychology. So in that way, this subject matter of the subject matter of the classification of homosexuality as abnormal and then not abnormal, that subject matter seems to be proprietary. Okay, so I said earlier that if inquiry goes well, there are different kinds of upshots it can have. So you can understand the mind by coming to know a hypothesis or a model or a theory. You can understand the mind by coming to understand the problem about the mind. And I just mentioned 2 such problems. And my third example of some things we know from the humanities about the mind is in a different category, where we come to understand some specific human experiences. So let me talk about that. Okay, let's start with a question. Should there be extreme pervasive inequality in society? So that's a basic question in politics. It is not a question about the mind. This is not a question about the mind. This is a question about how society should be organized. But to answer this question about how society should be organized, we need to know something about the mind. What do we need to know? We need to know something about experiences. So this question is like the question about what I should believe, in the sense that it's a question about what ought to be the case, how things should be, not about how things are. Okay, so let me give you an example of how experiences could be connected to politics. So slavery, that's a very stark example. Slavery tells a lie of inequality of human worth. And there are narratives that expose the lie. Slave narratives expose the lie. Fiction can expose the lie. Think about Huckleberry Finn, the story of a 12-year-old white boy and an escaped slave named Jim, and they paddle down the Mississippi. So these literary works, they exhibit the case for the abolition of slavery. Now there's a puzzle. The puzzle is, how could a piece of fiction that somebody made up, it's the product of Mark Twain's imagination, there was no such person, as the characters depicted in the novel, it's completely invented. So how could an invention of somebody's mind tell you anything about reality? How could it tell you about 19th century America? I'm going to save my answer to that question for the Q&A. Okay, now it's not just slavery that's illuminated by literature. It's not just slavery that, slavery is a political arrangement that generates experiences that are directly the result of this political arrangement. And literature can show us that connection, and in showing it to us, it can help us assess this question and, in fact, answer it. So by learning about the mind, you could answer a question about politics. Now, it's not just slavery. There is, in fact, a very long strand of American literature that does the same thing. So if you think about what chattel slavery did in the US, it opened up a very vast gulf of experience between Americans of African descent and Americans of European descent. Some of the most entertaining and engaging parts of Huck Finn are parts that exhibit this incredible gulf in the perspectives of these two people who are paddling down the Mississippi. Okay, but it didn't just stop with slavery. So this gulf across races in America persists after slavery. And a long strand of American literature illuminates the gulf. So I've listed some other works of fiction here that I think do that. Okay. Now, the gulf, it doesn't end with slavery. It's there with even formal inequality. It's there with formal inequality. And these works of literature explore the texture of life under these inequalities. And they convey what sorts of experiences these political arrangements that tolerate such persistent and extreme inequality give rise to. Okay? And when we learn about experiences under these circumstances, they help us think through what political arrangements ought to be like. Now, contemporary literary studies is often criticized for overemphasizing the political context or significance of works of fiction or art. So here's a quote from Stephen. I chose my 3 examples for maximum provocativeness. So Stephen says, literary studies has yet to recover from the disaster of postmodernism, its defiant obscurantism, dogmatic relativism, and suffocating political correctness, and they fail to define a progressive agenda. Well, it seems a little bit pessimistic to me. So it doesn't seem at all suffocating to view that long line of American literature as addressing a central question in politics and answering that question by depicting life under pervasive and persistent inequality. Some of the best literary criticism that I've read recently is precisely about this topic by Chris LeBron at Yale University. Okay, so some ought questions, questions about what we ought to do, can be answered by telling us something about the mind. Now, finding this illumination about the mind, about specific experiences, and its relationship to political arrangements, if you find that illumination, that doesn't tie your hands as to how you have to read every work of literature or approach any work of art. You don't have to read every work of literature as primarily an expression of its historic moment or as reflecting or speaking to political arrangements. I mean, some novels are just doing other things. So I'm not purporting to tell you this is what literature does, this is what philosophy does, this is what history does. And I'm not purporting to tell you what all of the contributions of to the study of the mind are made by the humanities. I'm just pointing out 3 different things that we know about the mind from the humanities. And if I have more time, I talk about other examples. I think there are a lot of examples that illustrate some forms of consilience. But I think Stephen and I differ on the overall picture of how the extent and the kind of consilience that there might be. Okay, now I'll end with 2 points. So one point is about the sense in which the contributions that I've listed here to understanding the mind from the humanities are proprietary to the humanities. So in what ways are they continuous with the sciences, in what ways are they discontinuous? Well, when you have textured, detailed narratives of this sort, you find in literature, you could ask whether that mode of inquiry is distinctive to the humanities. And there I think the answer is no, not really. There is, in science, an analog of those things, which is the case study. A case study is a narrative that sketches what happens in a particular case. Sometimes it even tells you about the conditions of a person or a patient that give you a good idea of what they might be experiencing. Okay, but I mean the best case study will of course, just pale in comparison to a literary narrative that's done well. For one thing, it's usually not as extensive. You would never get, you wouldn't get the full arc of a life from a case study the way you would get an understanding of the arc of the life of a Czech immigrant to Kansas from Willa Cather, for example. Okay. So if there's a proprietary contribution from the humanities, it's not at the level of the mode of inquiry. It's not the level of analyzing problems or giving thick descriptions. It's at the level of the subject matter, of what it is looking at. Okay, so now that my 3 examples are on the table, I want to see if we can address this big, heady question I began with. What can the humanities contribute to the study of the mind at a somewhat higher level of abstraction? So the sciences rely on entrenched judgments about what's plausible and what's not plausible. You cannot do any kind of scientific inquiry without taking on board, taking for granted previous scientific results. That's the way it works. When you decide what to control for in your experiment, you're making judgments about what the plausible controls are. You're not controlling for every possible other mechanism, because some of them are just crazy, like the ones that appeal to alien life forces or giant turtles in the sea. You don't have to control for giant turtles in the sea, because we know there aren't giant turtles in the sea that do what you're probably interested in doing when you do your experiments. Okay, when you try to decide what other alternative explanations you have to rule out, you are likewise appealing to things that we already know from science. So science is all about relying on entrenched judgments of plausibility. In philosophy and literature and history, the emphasis is somewhat different. So in the case of philosophy and literature, we rely very heavily on the imagination. Why? Well, because we're very often interested in what's possible. What are the possible solutions to the problem of what I should believe? When we study history, we are reminded of the impermanence of social arrangements and attitudes, whether there are attitudes about the mind, as in my example, or about anything else. So in all of these fields, the work is focusing us on what's possible. And because they do that, they have the potential to broaden the scope of what seems plausible, seems implausible. They have the potential to change our plausibility judgments. So it's really a very different focus, a different emphasis between the sciences and the humanities. And that's really the difference that underlies the different contributions to the study of the mind. So here, as elsewhere, I think really what we should aim for is harmony without hierarchy. Knowledge of the mind from outside science, of the sorts that I gave examples of, is different from putative knowledge that just opposes science. It's just about a different thing.
But I'd like to invite our two speakers now to talk a little bit to each other. And I think since Susanna already started talking to Steve in the course of her presentation and putting some things out on the table, maybe I'll invite Steve to start by putting to Susanna what he thinks of her argument for harmony as opposed to hierarchy, and the ways, in a sense, an argument for autonomy. For the humanities, simply doing something that has its own agenda and that doesn't necessarily require the enrichment that you're arguing would so benefit this malized and maligned part of the academy.
A couple of things. One is a comment on the absence of the study of the history of psychology within psychology departments. That is true now, but for most of the history of psychology, that was not true. When I was an undergraduate, not only did every department of psychology have a specialist in the history of psychology, but the absolute Bible was the book written at Harvard by E.G. Boring called The History of Psychology. The reason that that changed rather precipitously is that it soon became apparent that psychologists were bumbling amateur historians when they wrote a history of their own field. There's a joke about the two elderly professors who meet in the faculty club. One of them is a neurosurgeon and the other is a historian. And the historian says to the neurosurgeon, "What do you plan to do now that you're retiring?" He says, "Well, I'm planning to write a history of my field." And the historian said, "Yes, and I'm planning to take up brain surgery." So, I think there's a good reason that history of psychology is no longer done in psychology departments.
Doing it and there's knowing it.
Yes. Yes, right. And we know it is true that we no longer have that as part of the curriculum, and I do agree that something was lost if it's done competently, as psychologists tend to.
Although I have to say, my courses in the history of psychiatry and psychology, all concentrators get credit for them in your department, just to make
good.
It should be cross-listed.
Yeah, well, let's
yes.
leave that to your department meetings. Anyway, please, Steve.
So the question, that was just a comment, but I guess, is there anything in your presentation that you thought I or a typical scientist would disagree with?
Well, I think the differences in what you see the differences to be between the sciences and the humanities. So I think we're sort of opposite in that I was emphasizing the continuity in modes of inquiry and the discontinuity in subject matter. And you were emphasizing the continuity in subject matter. And, you were emphasizing the continuity in subject matter. Anything can be studied by science. You were emphasizing the, that's right. You were emphasizing the subject matter, but the discontinuity in modes of inquiry. So the modes of inquiry, like for example, when you said that, sure, you could have thick descriptions, but it wouldn't really give you any generalizations, or wouldn't tell you about causes. It wouldn't really explain too much.
Well,
so I think that's a difference in how we see what the differences are.
Okay, but I guess I'm still not seeing the point of disagreement, because I don't think there was anything that I overtly disagreed with, unless it was that the modes of inquiry that you just explained have nothing to learn from scientific modes of inquiry. That is, they could be done in isolation from scientifically accepted methodologies or ideas. So let me be concrete. So in to your first example of what should I believe,
Yeah.
is it relevant whether and to what extent a person can voluntarily change their belief? So if I'm walking along and I'm suddenly attacked by, let's say I was living during the wars of religion or the Inquisition, and someone said, "You must accept that Jesus Christ is your Savior, you must believe it," and I said, "and otherwise we will hoist you on the strappado," and I don't want to be hoisted on the strappado, so I say, "Yeah, sure, I believe it." Can I do that? And is there being anachronistic? If I could apply methods of scientific inquiry, such as, let's say we had a way of assessing true versus feigned belief using neuroimaging, and could answer the question, am I sincerely believing that Jesus Christ is my Savior, even though one might consider it to be a lie? Is that relevant to your question? Not that does it answer the question, because it is a normative question,
Right.
but in framing the question and in considering possible answers, would the possibility of voluntary change of belief for practical purposes, which is in some ways analogous to your case study of believing against the statistics that sheer determination will allow you to succeed, or one might say that that's a pragmatic rationale for a belief rather than a purely epistemic one. That is, the reason I want to uphold a belief is because it will bring me good things as opposed to it is likely to be true.
Yeah. Well, the conflict that I was describing arises because in cases where you believe what conforms to your interests, some of those cases are just blatantly irrational, like the climate change case. The Ebola case is different because it's more out of perhaps out of fear. It's not a case of wishful thinking. Maybe it's a case of fearful thinking. But on the question of would it be if we knew that you could voluntarily change a belief, how would that affect how you would address the normative question? I think there's a lot that you learn about the results of believing one way or another. Maybe you got the impression that in asking what should I believe, I was presuming that you could just decide what to believe. And in my example of the person who's determined and doesn't believe it, I wasn't picturing that they just say, nope, I'm not going to believe it. Cognitive dissonance theory tells us about the mechanisms by which somebody might get into that situation. You might discredit the source, you might say, well, these studies were flawed, or etc. So it's certainly relevant to things around the edges, and I find it very useful myself. I study epistemology. I find it very useful to learn about what psychologists tell us about belief change. But when you get down to the brass tacks of addressing the normative question, I don't think that there are answers to be found in psychology to the normative question.
Well, it's not that whether the normative question can be answered by psychology, but is a recognition of psychological facts, such as the phenomena of cognitive dissonance or the possibility of voluntary change of beliefs. Is it relevant to that discussion?
Sure.
That is, would it proceed in an identical manner if the theory of cognitive dissonance had never been devised or verified?
Well, philosophers have discussed for a long time whether there is such a thing, whether it's possible to voluntarily move your mind into belief the way you can voluntarily move your leg.
That's an empirical question, isn't it?
Well, it's an empirical question in the sense that it's a question about actual people's minds.
Yeah.
How do you answer that question? Well, the first thing you have to do is figure out what you mean when you're talking about belief, which is extremely difficult to do. There are lots of different mental phenomena that go under the same label, so there's some sorting to do before you can even know exactly what it is you're asking. For example, there are related phenomena like you are just going to accept for practical purposes that such and such is true. You're a teacher and some third grader comes and says, my homework fell into the dishwasher. And you just say, okay, I don't want to. I'm just going to go along with this. And then it turns out it really did fall into the dishwasher. So, something happens to you when you recognize that, and that illuminates the difference between what's sometimes called acceptance and belief. So can you move your mind voluntarily into acceptance? Well, maybe you can. But it's complicated. I think that cognitive dissonance does help you understand the extent to which you can or can't move your mind voluntarily into belief. But first we have to know what we're talking about when we even ask that question before we get to the brain scanner to see, well, are you or aren't you in the state of belief? We first have to figure out what that would even be.
No, I agree, although that's answering a slightly different question, which is, do you have to do conceptual analysis of the kind that philosophers specialize in order to have a coherent scientific theory to test, which I completely agree. But the question is, I'm asking the converse question, namely, can one sensibly address the philosophical question, the normative question, in the absence of knowing anything about the way that the human brain functions?
The human brain functions?
Human mind functions, assuming that the mind is the brain at a higher level of analysis.
Well, you might know zero about the brain, but so long as you knew something about the mind, what we do know about the mind. I mean, that was my point, that there's a lot that we know about the mind even without studying results of experiments. And so you could probably get some way with those questions. Yeah, I mean, for a long time when we didn't have before cognitive dissonance theory, the epistemology of belief didn't look all that different in terms of The conflict was raised by Clifford and James, and this is before cognitive dissonance theory.
But has there been no progress in the last 100 years in analyzing this question?
Oh,
as a
lots
result
of progress. There's been lots of progress.
And there's some of that. So, and has that progress been informed by questions like, or phenomena such as cognitive dissonance and other studies?
I wouldn't say so. No.
That it has proceeded and could proceed perfectly well in a vacuum? That is, with uninformed by any facts about how the human mind works that we've discovered in the last 100 years?
With that question? Maybe. I find it very illuminating to find phenomena, look at phenomena of belief change that we learn about from psychology, to subject them to epistemological scrutiny and ask, what would we say about these beliefs, what would we say about those beliefs? But as a historical point about the progress in philosophy in understanding this problem, historically epistemology hasn't been very informed by psychology, but it's made a lot of progress in analyzing the problem.
And I'm going to cut short this very interesting discussion. I just want to sort of make an observation about the structure of the disagreement that has emerged here. It really seem to be one about the degree to which the sciences are cannibalizing us or reducing us on the one side. It's really about the question of the autonomy versus the need for consilience. There's a image that's put forward of the humanities in a state of malaise and in need for the invigorating data of the sciences in order to flourish and move forward. And I think the counter-argument has been that actually there's a great deal of work that can be done autonomously in those fields on their own terms that contribute to the study and our understanding of the mind, but don't necessarily feel that hunger to draw on the data from the laboratory or elsewhere. Is that a fair sort of characterization, Susanna, of your...
Yeah. Can I ask Stephen a question?
Absolutely, it's your turn. I just wanted to sort of interrupt and move us up a level. And then after this next exchange, we'll open it up to you guys.
Okay, so when you were talking about the malaise of the humanities, at one point you said, well, we could attract lots of the brilliant minds of students who would otherwise study sciences. We could attract them to the humanities if there was more continuity and integration between these fields. And then you said, I think, well, in passing, maybe it was a joke, maybe it wasn't a joke. You said, and not coincidentally, that the donors, would maybe be more pleased. So, there is a picture of the university as modeled on a market. I mean, we have a little bit of language right here about shopping period and so on. But consider what would happen if you just only taught the works of fiction that people wanted to buy. So if you let the authority of the English department as to what works are worth studying, important to study, be determined by what people liked to buy to study. So they like to buy to read. So I think that would have a huge impact on the cultural value of literature. And I was wondering if you were suggesting something similar about the university. So do you think, well, look, what people really want, give the people what they want. What they want is to study the humanities in a way that's more continuous with the science. Is that a reason to reshape the curricula in the humanities?
Well, no, it's not the consumption of particular works of art, but it is the support of certain areas of scholarship. And first of all, as a practical matter, I don't think it's unreasonable to say, can we make a case that there is some opportunity for expansion of knowledge in a way that has not been done before and that promises exciting results, that is worth asking people to part with their money to support. And I don't think that's unreasonable given the realities of how research is funded. You have to make a case. There is a marketplace of ideas in terms of what promises insight, what has the potential for generating new knowledge, and there is a real marketplace for talent. And there it's not pandering to some kind of populist taste, but there's a question, if there's someone who is smart, intellectually curious, is pondering devoting their life to expanding human knowledge, can you present that person with something where they feel that there's a new contribution to be made, that they wouldn't just be recycling what's already been discovered, but that there is something where that person could apply their creativity to providing an insight that wasn't there before.
What would that do to the rest of the humanities? I mean, are you picturing transformation or just supplementation?
Well, enrichment, so no, not replacing traditional humanistic methods, but enriching them and diversifying them.
Yeah.
And there's, believe me, this is not an anodyne suggestion. And when the quote that you put up in the slide is the result of many emails that I've gotten from graduate students and recent graduates on the job market in the humanities, bemoaning the fact that they are unemployable if they propose some new way of doing things, or they can't get a thesis committee together. I'll be concrete. A scholar that I know, absolutely brilliant, both literary analyst and someone extremely competent in evolutionary biology, psychology, many other fields. He wanted for his, in an English department, he wanted to do a thesis looking at the Iliad and the Odyssey by analyzing the dynamic of the Trojan War in terms of male-male competition, as explained in part through the theory of sexual selection. So he was told that he was a Nazi, fascist, was going to be endorsing hierarchy and patriarchy, and that he may not do a thesis that cited Darwin. If he wanted to cite Lacan and Derrida and Foucault, that would be okay, but Darwin, no, that would be tantamount to Nazism. Now, I'm not making this up. I mean, he
Yeah,
has
but it's an
written it.
anecdote, it's not a bunch of statistics.
I would, there are enough reports, and I would be willing to go forward with the empirical prediction that's testable, that this would be a common phenomenon. Namely, if you were to have in a variety of English departments, if you were to give them graduate applicants, say, made up, and you had that as the subject matter, one could test this empirically with data, and I'd be very confident in the result. But you know, perhaps not here at Harvard, but in many departments this would be true. So that's an example of what I had in mind. This young man got a PhD in another department. The book was published to much acclaim, including by a number of classicists. But like many scholars in the humanities, he is effectively unemployed, scraping by with adjunct here, a course there. Now, I think that this is a tragedy for the humanities. I mean, he had much to offer in our understanding of Homer in a way that had not been done before, that was perfectly, thoroughly respectful of preceding scholarship within classics itself, but he was systematically blackballed for political and ideological reasons. And I mention this as a case study, but there are plenty of others, and I have a whole email file of people with similar complaints.
I'm going to open it up. Yes. And now let me ask you to step up and project, please.
Project. Am I projecting?
Yes, that's good.
I see the interchange versus the kind of question, or the interchange between the two as a kind of variant of,
Okay. That's even better.
is this better?
It's even better, yes.
As an interesting variant, C.P. Snow's Two Cultures, which is like 50 years down the pike now. It's not the same. I think there were problems with Snow, but I think the general analysis that he tried to put forth between science and the humanities is brought up to date now. And I would like to pose as an interesting intervening discipline the growing notion of psychohistory, which is bringing to bear psychological, scientific kind of reasoning into the more humanistic discipline of history and telling the history of our kind.
Yes, yeah, certainly the allusion to C.P. Snow is apposite. And Snow, a little more than 50 years ago, identified the two cultures of the science and the humanities and called for a third culture. He was a little vague as to whether this was social science or humanities scholars who made use of ideas from the sciences and vice versa. But that is very much like what I would like to see happen. That is, I don't think that the culture of science and scientists per se automatically have a mandate to draw generalizations from the subject matter of the humanities. It will require a kind of interdisciplinary training where ideas and methods from both fields are brought together. And that is what Snow called for 50 years ago. It's also interesting and quite resonant to the nature of the debate today that the major response to Snow by the literary scholar F.R. Leavis was, like a lot of reactions today, absolutely implacably opposed to any application of science whatsoever, that it was equated with a hostile takeover of the humanities, that there was no distinction between the idea that the methods of and ideas of the sciences could be profitably applied, and the idea that this was an utter obliteration. And in fact, the response by Leavis was so vituperative that the magazine that published it first had to get Snow to indemnify them against libel because they were afraid that it was almost unpublishable. It was so vitriolic. So I think some things don't change, and I think the essay is well worth reading today.
Yes, in the back, yes. And could I ask you to keep your questions or comments quite brief so we can get as many people involved as possible?
Sure. This has to do with Susanna's presentation, and in my perspective as a psychiatrist, neurologist, and functional neuroimaging researcher. And what I would say is, and someone who studied philosophy in the past, but what I would say is that it can be the case that that the humanities are incredibly valuable and can do things in a certain way that's illuminating and really important. But I think I take some opposition with the statements that the sciences can't do certain things. And some of the examples you gave, I think, when one considers within the context of translational behavioral neuroscience now or neuropsychiatry, there are very reasonable ways to approach this in a very rich way. So, for example, the issue of what is normative or not. Psychiatry has taken longer than cardiology or nephrology because you're dealing with the most complex functions, the most complex organ. But we're actually getting there, and the homosexuality DSM-3 example is part of history of sociology of a field rather than contemporary psychiatry and neuropsychiatry and what it represents. Similarly, the contemporary data-driven approaches that allow one through computation and statistics to address complexity can allow you to not just be hypothesis-driven and to look at things beyond what you were supposedly looking for. So just some points, and to make the final statement that the medical sciences have a way of integrating that is maybe a third leg of a stool that sometimes gets left out of such a discussion or bundled as applied, but in fact is and can provide insights that are complementary and integrative.
Thank you.
Yeah, I wasn't making a generalization about the illegitimacy of categorizations of certain medical conditions as normal or pathological. So I was pointing to an example where the social nature and the malleable nature of science is completely unavoidable, and it's part of what makes science work. It shows through. But yeah, you couldn't do psychiatry without a distinction between the normal mind. And so to say that the sciences couldn't speak to that, that would be like saying that they couldn't do psychiatry.
Yes, the man in the t-shirt with the wings. Everyone goes back to Lutzer.
Yeah, I was curious, as someone who does interdisciplinary communication, it's hard enough for me to convince physicists that what biologists say is a fact is a fact. And I feel like Pinker, Dr. Pinker in particular, your example, you tend to speak of facts, evidence, and empirical interchangeably. From my perspective as an evolutionary biology, psychology doesn't necessarily fall in the realm of science. So I wondered if both of you could address what standard are you using for claiming that something is a scientific fact or scientific evidence as opposed to some other field of endeavor?
Well, it's hard to answer that question generically because it would depend on the question and the field and the quality of the evidence available. The standard would just be how much confidence do you have that something is true based on the facts available to you. And in complex, messy, historically contingent domains, the evidence necessarily is going to be less conclusive, and one's confidence in a particular generalization is going to be lower. So, if you're doing, there are certain experiments that you can't run on humans for ethical reasons, so one is therefore constrained as to how confident you can be in, say, nature-nurture questions if you can't bring up children in an environment of your own design the way you could with mice. And so our standards of proof necessarily have to be lower. It's an impetus to come up with more ingenious indirect methods. They'll still never be as dispositive as methods in biology where you have much greater control. And likewise, it's not just what you can do ethically, but the fact that many aspects of the environment are one-shot occurrences that one can't replicate. The history of the English language only happened once. You can't run an experiment in which the linguistic evidence available to a child is different from what English is. English is what English is, and we're kind of stuck with that. And so the standards in psycholinguistics are going to be lower than what they would be in, say, chemistry, where the relevant histories are far more controllable, manipulatable, and replicable.
I think the question of demarcating the sciences from the humanities is probably the least important thing to do. The distinctions that matter are the distinctions between different modes of inquiry, and I argue that we find a lot of continuity in those. I don't know how to do an experiment, roughly, but if I actually try to do it, I don't think I have magic hands. So that's something the humanities can't do, but the modes of inquiry are really continuous. So if there are differences, they're really differences in what it is that we study, which raises Stephen's questions about how much the sciences could inform the normative questions I talked about, how much they could tell us about certain types of experiences. And I want to take issue with one thing you said about generalizations and causes. So you might say, well, it's all fine to have thick descriptions, but we don't learn anything from them. If you're to learn something, it would have to take the form of a generalization. I think that's not quite right. When literary narratives are done well and when they're convincing because they give us insight into people. And when we have insight into people, that is a form of generalization. There's an illusion of particularity because it's just about one person in Kansas who's a Czech immigrant. It's only about her. It's not only about her. It's about any number of people who could have been in her situation in the Willa Kaplan novel. It's not just about Jim the slave. Jim could be any. It didn't have to be about this fictional character as opposed to that fictional character. So I think there are more generalizations than you might be allowing for that are inherent in literature that's really moving and convincing.
Well, I think there is a genuine disagreement there, because how do you know that you're right? So, for example, let's say it isn't the what we would post hoc consider to be an accurate portrayal of the lived life of a slave, but let's say it was some anti-Semitic stereotype like Fagin in Oliver Twist or Shylock, and we would dispute that this is actually the way that Jewish moneylenders or Jewish underworld figures would have experienced their lives. It's not enough just to have a literarily compelling description. We have to have some way of knowing whether it's accurate.
That's what's nice about literary criticism, is that you can explore these questions. One of the novels that I mentioned, called Pym by Matt Johnson, it contains within it a whole set of literary discussion of Arthur Gordon Pym, Edgar Allan Poe's novel, and its depiction of the dark-skinned people who come out of various moments in it. So it's not that every description is necessarily accurate, but there is something to the idea that you describe people in a way that rings true. It might ring true to you because you yourself have sort of stereotypes or outlooks, but that's why it's so important and valuable to discuss literature.
Well, I think, let me just follow up on that. So, no, it is certainly valuable, but if you want to know whether you're right or wrong, ringing true won't cut it, because many false things ring true.
Ringing true in, an extended course of inquiry can bring to light exactly what you might be right or wrong about. And some cases of ringing true really will cut it. Some cases of, I think we have to hold to that. If we didn't hold to that, it would be, rampant relativism and impossibility of communication.
Can I just bring in some other ideas? So I know we could keep going, but I want to just get some more questions in. You had a question yeah. And then I've got someone over there next, and then in the front. And then we'll see where we are in terms of time.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So I had a question about the two kinds of reductionism. I thought there was a bit of a bait and switch here because, you said this bad one, we're all going to reduce it to physics, and I was like, yeah, that sucks, I agree. And then you're like, no, there's this one, there's this harmony, blah, blah, blah. And then when you went on and explaining it, you said the following. What happens is we have this high-level explanation, and there's a lower-level explanation where we explain the unexplained things in the higher level. And when you talked about the unexplained things, you said, the magic, and then there were a series of rather insulting terms used to talk about the thing the higher level presupposes but can't explain. And I feel like, it's a philosophical argument that's being needed to say we can offer this type of explanation, but it's even harder to say we need to offer this type of explanation to have a right to posit the things at the higher level. And it seemed like you slid between saying, here's something that would be good for us to do if we could do it, and saying something like, here's the way it's got to go. Either you explain it at this lower level, or it's magic. And it's that latter view that snuck into your presentation, I think, kind of makes people think, to go into hyperbolic language, you're being a type of imperialist here, because, I say there's this normative stuff, I'll give you my great theory of it, you say, hey, we looked at the brains, we couldn't find any normativity, we can't give any explanation of it at the lower level, so it's magic. And I think, like, what principle justified that inference? We couldn't explain it at the lower level, so it's magic. So I'm just wondering, do you have anything to say about why I should buy in? I buy in that we can investigate things in lots of different ways and they should fit together. I don't buy into the fact that if I can't explain it at what you call a lower level of explanation, that ipso facto shows that I don't have a right to posit it at a higher level.
No, you certainly have a right to posit it, and it could be real but unexplained, genuine, there's no denying that it exists, but it's just incomplete and unsatisfying. That is, you don't want to pull phenomena out of the air and just say they are, and you might be right, they might exist whether or not you understand why they exist. But I think the history of science and of intellectual inquiry comes in exercising the curiosity and saying, well, it exists, but I'm not going to stop there. I'm going to ask the question, why does it exist? And it's been spectacularly successful in the sciences. I see no reason why it couldn't be as successful in history, political science, and so on. Again, that is not necessarily true of purely conceptual questions, purely logical questions. It's not that you pull a principle of logic out of the air, empirically speaking, and I don't think that has to be unpacked in terms of physics. When it comes to phenomena, like certain kinds of social change, certain kinds of motives of leaders, certain aesthetic reactions in the arts, you're right, they exist whether or not we can explain them, but we also want to explain them.
No, please.
Yes, I would be. Hello? Yes, I would be interested to hear Dr. Pinker's thoughts on the role of imagination in the sciences and the humanities. I think I heard Dr. Siegel say that it was a major distinguishing feature between the two spheres, that there was a much greater emphasis on the imagination in the humanities than in the sciences. And that may be, but I certainly think that the best science is extremely imaginative, and I would say is as imaginative as the best fiction or whatever example you would like to take from the humanities. Think of what a leap it is to think, to imagine that what causes the apple to drop could also cause the moon to be held in orbit around the Earth. That kind of blows your mind, right? So, how much does it cleave, do you think, between the two spheres?
Yeah. No, I'm glad you raised it, and I completely agree. There's fantastic exercise in the imagination in science. In at least two ways. One of them is that any causal story presupposes a certain counterfactual. So if you're saying A causes B, you have to imagine what would the world be like if there was no A. That's just part and parcel of a causal explanation. But also because so much of science consists of positing things that you literally can't see. That you're interpreting gels in terms of molecular interactions that you couldn't possibly see with your own eyeballs. And in every other domain of science, you have to posit unobservables that are products of your imagination, and you test to see whether they're reasonable descriptions of reality.
But do you think in general, in practice, though, that there is a greater emphasis on the imagination in the humanities?
You want to grab that one?
I mean,
No, I'm not sure that there is, but
I think that it's used in different ways. So I agree with your point that, of course, there's the exercises of imagination in the sciences. But there's a bit more freedom in the humanities just because you're not in the midst of a kind of inquiry that depends so heavily on plausibility judgments in the way that the sciences do. But if there are no imagination in the sciences, you wouldn't have these enormous shifts of scientific paradigms and theories. With all that said, in what Kuhn called normal science, there's much less kind of radical imagination than there is at those moments that you probably have in mind when you're talking about the ideas that blow your mind.
So yeah, we're going to go until 6:45. We're going to take a question up here, a question in the back, and a question over there, and then I think we'll wrap up. I'm sorry. So try to, if we can go through the questions really fast, we'll take a few more.
For Dr. Siegel. So you set up your talk with dividing science on one side and saying that kind of drawing a clear is-ought distinction that science establishes is, but doesn't give you ought. And that it seemed like you were suggesting that the humanities fill in that gap and give you that ought. And I'm wondering if humanities can convince a person of ought, or if they really license a logical ought. And if you could speak to that distinction.
That's a logical ought.
Is it normatively true that if you gave that piece of literature to a computer that had a certain set of logical rules, would it come to the same ought conclusion that a human would? So humans are notorious for having a promiscuous system of believing things against the evidence and being convinced of things and having all kinds of feelings for horrible reasons. And I wouldn't want to take as evidence, as Steve was saying, the feeling that something was compelling.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if that's just a hallucination in the humanities, or if there really is something special that licenses the ought for the humanities that doesn't for the science.
I think I see what you're saying. When I read those, do the humanities fill in the gaps of the oughts? There's lots. The humanities are very broad, set of enterprises, and not all of them are concerned with what ought to be. I chose, specific examples of cases where they are concerned about that, and do they make progress with answering that question? Yes. Could you explain it away as some, big illusion, or if you read, one slave narrative after another and all these other novels, which I highly recommend to you, is it just at the end of the day some kind of open question whether slavery should be abolished? I don't think it's some open question, and it would really be absurd. And to think, well, how do you know you're right? Sometimes you know you're right.
We're going to get right back into the next question.
As a PhD student, I wanted to bring in this man's question about imagination, but also back to the both sides of the conversation about market forces in the academy, and to bring in some anecdotal information, some anecdotal snippets. So I think at NPR, and there were a few other articles recently that sort of tracked a bunch of tenure-track scientists who had decided to step down from their positions in part because they felt like the funding structures did not allow for them to make the kind of imaginative leaps that initially brought them to science. And so I was just wondering if both speakers could reflect on, or I guess I should say one other thing. I'm in an anthropology PhD program, and I sit in a proposal writing seminar that goes for 4 hours where we were all constantly challenged to say, if there's not something new that you're doing here, there's no way that you're going to get funding. So this notion of that in the humanities or the social sciences we might simply be recycling old things. I think that doesn't actually stand on empirical grounds.
No, I think there is, I think many scientists are coming to realize that there is a pathology in the mechanisms of funding of the sciences that is not encouraging young blood and new ideas as much as it should. And that this should be addressed. It's too much of the funding is going to established labs, and too much young talent is being diverted because the new ideas can't be funded. And the funding agencies are exploring mechanisms to try to divert this baleful development.
Did you have a response or anything? All right, we're going to take one more question. I think that will wrap it up, and thank you all for staying with us. So let's take the final question, please.
So what was here? Yeah. So what was striking to me about Steve's anecdote about the student who, had this interesting thesis about evolutionary psych and the Iliad and all of these great texts, is that not only was he not hired by the English department, but he wasn't hired by a science department either. And I wondered if maybe each of you could speak just for a minute about, presupposing both that the anecdote does reflect a trend in the field and that there are other people that are in this situation, and also presupposing that the type of work that he's doing, where you're taking interesting scientific phenomena and using them to apply, new analyses to humanistic enterprises, but presupposing that that's a good idea. Whose responsibility do you think it is in the academy to hire these people? And is it the case that English departments should be starting to hire scientists? Is it the case that science departments should be trying to hire humanists? Should there be a new department? How's this going to work?
Well, I think it's a profound question, and it speaks to some of the problems with the organization of contemporary university, where departments control appointments, and some of the most exciting work defies these legacy boundaries, but universities are not equipped to keep up with that intellectual ferment. So it is not just a problem with the humanities, it's a problem with the way universities are organized. If you ask deans and provosts and presidents, as I have, they'll say, well, the problem is if we have new appointments that don't belong to departments, we'll be accused of arrogating power to the central administration, taking it away from the faculty, and so there is a lot of proprietary feeling about appointments within departmental structures that I think gets in the way of promotion of young talent. So I think it's a problem that universities have not addressed and ought to address for this very reason, because the boundaries between the sciences and the humanities are legacies. These are silos that are not easy to break down, but should be broken down.
Do you want to respond, or?
Yeah, just quickly, there are a lot of pressures that come from professionalization that just cut across the disciplinary boundaries, and all of these pressures are bad. One of my favorite pieces by Pinker is the piece in the Chronicle about why academic writing stinks. I thought that was fantastic. And it explained why you find pressures toward obscurity and insularity. And those are bad forces. They're bad intellectually, and they're bad at the level of writing. They're also tied to, in any domain where practices become normal, you have all sorts of judgments about what ring true. And again, we go back to the point about the indispensability of judgments of plausibility in science. So when a hypothesis rings true or rings false, that does cut it in science, and it can't but cut it. So I don't think we can avoid that kind of epistemology.
I'm going to give one more person the mic, that young woman here in the middle.
This question is for Professor Pinker. So in the past, there have been other reorganizations of academic fields, such as in the Renaissance, the academic fields were very different. There was law and astronomy and things like that. So your radical call for the reorganization of all of our academic fields, is that just one more iteration of what has happened in the past, or are you going towards some sort of ultimate goal of what will be the best organization?
Yeah, I don't know what would be the optimal organization, although I think there should be much more experimentation than what we have now. There was a proposal a number of years ago by my friend Michael Gazzaniga that universities should just dissolve departments, and there should be faculty. They should form ad hoc groupings when there's mutual interest in a given problem, but that the traditional legacy should just be dissolved in one fell swoop. Now, I don't know if that's the optimum way of doing it, and I think only by some degree of experimentation could we find out that perhaps there could be a diverse ecosystem of universities that are organized along different lines. MIT has a slightly different organization, say, than Harvard, where there are more centers, interdisciplinary centers and programs and schools, but there too, power ultimately resides in departments because they do hiring and they do tenure. I would like to see more experimentation. I don't have the answer, but I think that I don't think that the current system, almost a monoculture across American universities, is at the optimum, given what's happening to the forces for consilience, the breakdown of traditional silos. We should be more innovative.
Maybe that's the note on which to end. We should be more innovative. And please join me in